Hello, fellow book lovers, both readers and writers. I am Matty Dalrymple. I'm the author of the Ann Kinnear Suspense Novels and Suspense Shorts and Lizzy Ballard Thrillers. And I also write, speak, consult, and podcast about the writing craft and the publishing voyage. And I share what I learn on the INDY AUTHOR PODCAST. And you can find out more about me and my work at mattydalrymple.com and at theindieauthor.com. And this is my video series, What I Learned, where I ask 2 questions of authors about their latest book. What did they learn from their latest book that they'd like to share with their fellow authors? And what did they learn from their latest book that they'd like to share with their fellow readers? And today I'm here with Chris Quarembo. Hey, Chris, how are you doing?
Good, thanks. Great to be here, and thank you
Oh, it is my
for
pleasure.
inviting me. Yes.
To give our viewers a little bit of background on you, Chris is an award-winning former news reporter who also worked as a speechwriter and ghostwriter for corporate executives. Killer Deals, which I have my copy of right here, my copy of Killer Deals. Killer Deals is her debut novel. She's also published short stories in the crime and mystery genre. And when she's not reading or writing, Chris loves live theater, art museums, and travel, especially in France and Italy. That sounds lovely. She is also a volunteer docent at the Barnes Foundation and Early Modern Art Collection in Philadelphia. And as I mentioned, her latest book is Killer Deals. So today I am asking Chris the 2 What I Learned questions, starting with what did you learn from Killer Deals that you'd like to share with your fellow authors?
Well, first of all and foremost, I learned the extreme importance of point of view because I initially started writing Killer Deals in third person, and I'm part of a critique group. And so we share our work on a monthly basis. And so I shared the initial early chapters with my colleagues, and they kept asking questions about my protagonist, Andrea Fabiano, saying that they didn't feel that they knew enough about her, that they didn't know if I was really developing what they said was a well-rounded character, which is very important in any novel, but especially in the genre of crime fiction, because you're following her throughout the book. So I went back to the drawing board and I wrote and rewrote the novel in first person. And right away, her character just popped off the page. And it was very, very clear that when you write from her point of view, you're getting inside her head. You're learning her thoughts, feelings, her reactions to things that are going on. And when I shared that again, then with my colleagues in the critique group, they definitely started understanding more about her, liking her. And that's like so critically important to a book. You have to be on the journey with this character. And I do remember when I read an interview with Frank McCourt, and he said he struggled to writing or attempting to write Angela's Ashes. And this process went on for years until he started telling the story from the point of view of the child. And then it just like, it really clicked, if you will. And you know that Angela's Ashes is like this critically acclaimed work. And also it was a bestseller. So it really, I think it is something that authors and writers really need to consider when they're developing a work, to really think about what's the most effective point of view that will work best for the particular story that they're telling.
Angela's Ashes is a really interesting example because I have to say that if someone woke me up in the middle of the night and said, Angela's Ashes, I think of that as an autobiography. And I think of it as an autobiography because it's written in first person. I really can't imagine that book being not written in first person.
Yeah, exactly. And also from the child's point of view, which is very different. I guess in a way it was a memoir, right? But it still is like I said, he was really struggling to figure out how to tell that story. And I am the other point is I'm totally grateful to my critique group. And that was the other thing that I learned, that really to get critiquing early on in the process, because they can set you straight as to issues that you might have with character, plot, or even the clarity of the story. And it really helps. I mean, I kept continuing to draft, but I would make sure that I had notes on what everyone had to say and then incorporate those critical changes, if you will, in the editing process. Because the more eyes, I think, the better. The beta readers are good, but you usually utilize those at the end of the process when the novel is complete and probably edited. And that's great. I learned a lot from that as well. But I think getting early critiquing helps you to get on the road to the right path, if you will, and the right journey on this book early on at night, and not have to do massive rewrites afterwards.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I'd be curious for your opinion on the idea that the more eyes, the better. I definitely agree with, but sometimes the more pens, the better is not the same thing. So, how
Yes,
did you weigh if you give a draft work to six people, you're
yes.
likely to get six different perspectives on it. So,
Well,
how did
that's
you
true.
assess? How did you go about getting that into your work and knowing what you
Well,
advise you not
yeah,
to?
no, no, that's a great question. Well, I would first of all say that I have a very unique writers group. They're really very, very good, and they give very good constructive critiquing. There's no nastiness. It's all, the whole intention is to help make the work better. But I also learned a long time ago, exactly, like I have experience where people have all these different opinions. The bottom line is you decide what you are writing. It's your novel, it's your work, and you evaluate what you're given as to see whether it helps improve the writing and the project that you're working on, because it's not their work. And sometimes I have had people tell me how they would write the book or a story, but it's not theirs to tell, it's yours.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I weigh when I'm looking at. And also, if two or three or four people say the same thing, I think you need to look at it, because there might be like one outlier, but also like I said, I think it's important what they're telling you and evaluate the validity of it, because it's not helpful to say, oh, I don't really like that character. Well, why don't you? And what do you think about it? Or maybe I'm writing a character that I don't want you to like.
Right.
So it really is the intent, I think, of the work. And I think the author determines that.
Yeah, I've heard several of my guests on the Indie Author Podcast say this, and I think it makes a lot of sense that when you hear a reader's reaction, it's always important to listen to it and assess what they're saying. But if
Yes.
you have a reader tell you how to fix the problem, probably not. For
Yeah.
exactly the
I
reason
mean,
you're saying, it's not their
great,
work, it's your work.
yeah, that's a great point. Yeah. Yeah. They tell you what you should do instead.
Yeah,
I mean, you can offer suggestions, but it's really up to the writer to determine whether they accept it or not. But I also think it's important to have an open mind and have a thicker skin, if you will. For one of the things that I do a lot too is, and when people are giving me criticism, I just listen to it. I don't interrupt them or say, "Oh, I disagree" or whatever. It takes a time to evaluate what they're saying and not be so sensitive. So, like, I don't think I write deathless prose. It can be changed.
yeah. Everything you're saying is so in line with a conversation I had back in episode 88 of the Indie Author Podcast called How to Give and Receive Critique with Tiffany Yates Martin. And
Oh, good.
actually, I read that title wrong because it was how to receive and give critique, because we both agreed that you have to kind of understand how to receive it before you
Yes.
exercise giving it.
Yeah. And I think the criteria is, are you helping someone improve their work? Like if it's something constructive. And like I said, a lot of times it doesn't help me say, I like this or I don't like this. It's not really substantive enough to help the writer figure out what they need to do, if they need to do anything. That's my opinion anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to switch over to the second
Yes.
part of the what I learned, which is what did you learn from your latest book that you would like to share with your fellow readers?
Yes. Well, I would say, first of all, my initial goal writing Killer Deals was to write a crime novel with a strong female protagonist. And I wanted to set it in Philadelphia because it's a city that I knew very well. But then as I was writing and developing the story and the plot, I, I knew that there was this underlying theme that I wanted to then bring in, because I will preface this by saying I was a newspaper reporter and I covered many criminal trials, particularly murder trials. And during that process, I started to really think about the impact of violence on children, whether they're victims or survivors or maybe witnesses. And so I wanted to have a layer of that kind of a plot in the overall story, because what I observed was that if particularly if some of a child witnesses a really brutal crime, it has an impact on their whole lives. I don't want to go into the gory details of some of the cases that I saw and covered, but really they are the like you say, the unintended consequences of violence, and, excuse the expression, collateral damage, because it just doesn't go away. So I don't want to get too specific about killer deals, but it is an underlying theme. And it's another layer, if you will, on the story. And I think it enriches the story. But I don't want to be a spoiler and talk about just how this is incorporated into the book.
I have to ask you also about the location, since I'm also a Philadelphia area person.
Yes.
And how did you handle the queuing up the location for readers, some of whom were going to be familiar with the area and say, oh, yeah, I've been there, or oh, yeah, I recognize what that is just under a fake name, and people who aren't?
Well, I've thought about this a lot. So I tried most of the time to use authentic locations. I only really changed the name of a school because I didn't want to use a real school. And I think it enriches the experience for people who are familiar. But I've read so many urban crime novels, and I don't think it matters if they know it or not. Do you know what I mean? That sounds odd, but like you get to learn something about the city. I was trying to make the city a character in the book, and I'm not comparing myself at all to these writers that I'm going to mention. But I mean, one of my favorite authors is Dennis Lehane. And if you read his books, even if you've never been to Boston, you know a lot about it.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of that. Well, like going back a little farther, Sarah Paretsky wrote a series it started in the 80s, so it goes back a little bit. But her PI is in Chicago, V.I. Warshawski. And again, I didn't know much when I started reading her books. I didn't know much about Chicago, but you learn a lot. And then the city becomes part of the story, is basically it. And I also find it's fascinating because I've also, other than this is a slightly different approach, but like I like to read books where I learned something about a culture that I never knew about or didn't know enough about. And one that springs to mind is Tony Hillerman and the Navajo. I mean, I learned so much because he did an accurate job and incorporating it in the stories that he's telling. It doesn't diminish the stories. He's not taking it actually adds another layer to the story.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I think that the people who recognize the area enjoy the little Easter eggs of recognizing things. And
Yes.
then is, as you're saying, fun to learn about it through a
Yes.
fictional work.
I think what's really funny is that over the weekend, I talked to someone who read the book, my book, and his wife about, she said to him that she wanted to go to one of the restaurants that's mentioned in my story.
Is it a real restaurant?
It is. Oh yeah. No, I used all real restaurants. The only thing I used that wasn't real is the name of the school.
Yeah.
It's mentioned, a prep school, because I didn't think I would get away with. Well, I didn't want to do that. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, you should get some kind of royalties for all the diners that you send to the restaurants that you mentioned in your book.
I know, but it is funny, isn't it? She wants to go to eat there. So I hope they enjoy it.
Yeah, well, you obviously made it appealing enough sounding in your book that she was interested.
Well, yeah, because there's a lot of food in my book.
Ah, good. Did you tap into your France and Italy connections for that?
Well, it was more, well, it's mostly Italian, but they go to a tapas restaurant. So it just, again, to get a feel, because in Philadelphia, East Passyunk Avenue is like this area of lots and lots of different ethnic restaurants and different cuisines. And it's really a really fun area to go to. So they have all kinds, even though South Philadelphia was originally a totally Italian area. Well, Italian and maybe Irish, but now there's like all kinds of ethnic groups that live there. So there's all kinds of restaurants, which is kind of fun. And again, it gives a sense of the character of the city.
Well, I don't think that any of my previous guests on What I Learned have been able to provide as part of their offering to readers a little dining guide to a certain location. So that will be yet another recommendation for people to pick up their copy of Killer Deal. So Chris, congratulations again on the publication.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Sure,
and it's been a pleasure speaking with you. It's very, very a nice opportunity to talk with you.
Oh, it's fun for me as well. Please let the viewers know where they can go to find out more about you and Killer Deals online.
Well, I have a website. It's just simply my name, chrisquarembo.com. The book is available on Amazon, I should mention also bookshop.org, because it benefits independent booksellers, which I think is very important. And of course, it's also on Barnes & Noble. It's available in paperback, but it's also available as a ebook.
Great. Very good. Thank you so much, Chris.
Well, thank you. It was lovely.